I'm Amy Sherman. I'm Associate Vice President of Innovation and Policy at CAIL. I know many of you, and those that I don't know, I hope I get to know in the next day or two. First, I just want to say good morning. I'd like a good morning back. There we go. There we go. Is this a more timely session? I think this one is very important for all of us, because if there was ever a time we need to be an informed advocate and voice for the adult learner, it's now. And to do that, we need to really understand the implications of the election, some of which we can't do 2 days after, but we can start to get a better understanding, and to start to think about our strategies and how we want to talk about adult learners in the policy arena, because the voice can't just be the policy experts. We who do the work need to be there advocating for the adult learner. And I want to start this session by saying, don't give up. There's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot we can still do right now. So with that, I want to say we are very fortunate today, because we have two people who have been in the trenches of federal policy for decades, who are here to talk to us today and help us start to get that understanding. So here's the game plan. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to just go right into a conversation about the election on the broader scale, what it means for higher ed and workforce policy, and then obviously allow times to get your input, your questions, and your comments. How does that sound, everybody? Good? Okay. So who do we have with us? First, we have Lee Foley. Raise your hand, Lee. There you go, Lee Foley. He is president and managing partner of Capitol Hill Partners. He's, for more than 30 years, he has worked as one of Washington's foremost counselors on policy and legislative advocacy. Prior to his lobbying career, Lee served in a variety of positions in Washington, including as White House Domestic Policy Advisor, Chief of Staff to the predecessor agency to the Office of Community Services at the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. He also served on the staff of the U.S. Senate's Labor and Public Welfare Committee, now known as HELP, and at the Senate Finance Committee. Bill Hoagland is the Bipartisan Policy Center Senior Vice President, and in this capacity, Bill helps direct and manage fiscal, health, and economic policy analyses. Before joining BPC in September of 2012, Bill served as Vice President of Public Policy for the Cigna Corporation. Prior to joining Cigna, Bill completed 33 years of federal government service, including 25 years on the U.S. Senate staff. From 2003 to 2007, he served as the Director of Budget and Appropriations in the office of the Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. In this role, Bill assisted in evaluating the fiscal impact of major legislation and helped to coordinate budget policy for the Senate leadership. So we have the right people at the table. Let's not waste any time. Let's come on over here. And we thought we would start with talking just first briefly on the broader scale of what happened with the election, get some insights and analysis. And let's start with Bill. Maybe you could talk a little bit just about the big picture of what just happened.
Okay. Thank you very wonderful setup. Yeah, how am I going to? I guess it's been the shock heard around the world, and I am with the Bipartisan Policy Center. If you can believe bipartisanship, just a little bit of quick background on that. It was an organization that was established literally 10 years ago. We'll be celebrating our, taking down my notes, okay. 10 years ago by 4 former majority leaders of the United States Senate. On the Democratic side, it was Senator George Mitchell and Senator Tom Daschle. And on the Republican side, it was Senator Bob Dole and the late Senator Howard Baker. And as the name would imply, our goal was at that particular time for these leaders saw the partisanship delaying the ability to move forward on major issues, and we'll try our best to work in that area. So let me say it's good to be out of Washington before the proverbial swamp is drained, and I am part of it. So I'm here and back in the Midwest, where is my home. Before I left Washington yesterday morning or yesterday afternoon, somebody asked me if I was shocked. And I responded that no, I wasn't shocked. In large part because, and yes, as you indicated, I worked for Republicans, all cards on the table here, and I was somebody with all cards on the table. I was one of those Republicans that who I have to admit was not completely enamored with our party's candidate. But I wasn't shocked because I had just finished last weekend this book here, the New York Times bestseller called Hillbilly Elegy. I don't know if anybody has read this or not, by J.D. Vance. And those who've read it know, but just in background quickly, it's a story about his real life growing up in southwestern Ohio across the river from Kentucky and Appalachia, where a number of his relatives had moved back and forth between. And quite frankly, I'm very familiar with the area. I grew up in southern Indiana. And it's about the frustration, it's about the desperation of many poor black and white families from the lack of jobs, opportunities, drugs, meth, cultural threats. And let's be honest, when you look at the maps this morning and see it on the front page, you'll see these were the folks and the people that helped break the so-called blue wall for Donald Trump. No question about it. And so from my perspective, if ever there was a reason for career and technical training programs that focus on new careers, new opportunities, growth, I think Hillbilly Elegy makes the case very strongly in that as we're going forward. Having said that, let me just be clear that I'm not overly sanguine, and we'll get into this a little later with Lee, I imagine, on what the outlook is for higher ed, even the pending Perkins reauthorization act that's in the lame duck session, but jobs broadly. And that is the theme. That is the theme that Mr. Trump has won on, the creation of jobs, increasing jobs. Now, his approach is maybe a little anti-normal Republican theory in terms of trade, but putting walls up on trade, putting up high tariffs on trade, may have a short-term benefit, but long-term, and I'll be honest about it, I have real concerns about his policies there. But the other theme that came through very clearly, and it was on both sides, it was on both Secretary Clinton's proposals as well as it was on his proposal, and that's infrastructure, the investment in infrastructure. And so once again, when you're talking about the expansion of jobs and opportunities and growth, in infrastructure requires jobs, requires people to move forward. That's when you need the technical people, the technical assistance, the growth. And so again, I come back to the work that you do. I think if policymakers focus on this, we'll realize that this is the area where they need to be focusing going forward. But to the broader specific question about what happened the other day, there are many Monday morning quarterbacks going on this. I don't know that I can add anything more than you've already read or heard. It's very early. But to the specific question, first of all the polling that came out, and of course we know polling wasn't very good in this whole exercise for those pollsters, but apparently real data shows that voters did not like Trump at all. 68% of the voters viewed him unfavorably, and yet 15 to 20% of those who viewed him unfavorably still voted for him. Why? I think it comes down to one word. It's change. Don't play on words here. Change trumped status quo. And I had worked with Senator when she was a senator, Clinton. I know she's a very knowledgeable person, a very good, very policy-oriented, but she resonated status quo. And I think the American public, upset, hillbilly elegy, signaled that we wanted to change, and we were willing to do anything for that. So Mr. Trump now is our president-elect. I'll come back to that in a second. There's another couple of other elections that took place, of course, and that's the Congress, House and Senate. As it turns out this morning, I think it's clear that the Senate has changed by adding 2 new Democrats, and in the House, House Democrats have added close to 6 to 7. Not what everybody expected. I worked in the Senate. I worked for Republicans, as I said. I truly did expect that the Senate was going to flip. So I had to change my thoughts coming out here completely as to how I was going to respond to you. But the bottom line is that the Senate remains Republican, the House remains Republican, but the margins have narrowed. Further, when you back up for a second, further when you look at this, you also see, of course, that the popular election out there favored slightly Mrs. Clinton over Mr. Trump. But the Electoral College is what was the change that took place there. So Mr. Trump comes in as the new president, our 45th president in January, with one of the lowest ever popularity ratings ever recorded for an incoming president. Guess what? Congress has the lowest favorability ratings that have ever been recorded since those statistics have been collected. You have 2 very unpopular positions in terms of the president and the Congress coming in. So I conclude, and maybe this is a little bit selfishness working for the Bipartisan Policy Center, I conclude, if anything, this is the opportunity to come together, to work together, to bring together the 2 sides. Because if you are up for election in 2 years, and there's another election, ladies and gentlemen, you know it's coming, another one in 2 years, another one in 4 years. If you're looking out into the future and you're coming in with such low popularity, then you want to produce. You want to act. You want to act on those campaign promises. You want to move forward. And the only way to move forward in this environment, with the narrow margins that exist now in the Congress, both in the Senate and the House, you will have to use those magic words that Mr. Madison so beautifully had inscripted within our Constitution, so to speak, is the word compromise. Work across the aisle. I don't think coming out of this election, we are still divided. You can see we're divided, but I can't see how the American public really cares whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. They just want to see something done as it relates to this issue of jobs and growth in the economy that we see. So let me just kind of close out here with a little. Many of you are probably mad. If I could guess, the majority of you are mad or upset or despondent. Maybe some of you are not despondent. My wife has a relative who lives in London and emailed me yesterday and was all concerned about our election. And I emailed her back and told her that, interestingly enough, remember, ladies and gentlemen, we do not elect a king, and I told her that. We do not elect a prime minister. We do not elect a dictator. We elect a president. And the beauty of our constitutional system and the tripartite system is we have a Senate, we have a House. And even though Republicans control, and now Republicans will have to perform, the one lesson I learned very early as a young staffer in the United States Senate was the fact that you need 60 votes to really move legislation. That, to me, the margin has narrowed. That, to me, suggests to you you should look forward, that there's an opportunity here, an opportunity, particularly with the focus on jobs, to move forward with your area. So I guess I would suggest that cue up Gloria Gaynor. You were asking about you were asking about a song. Oh, yes, we will survive.
And I'm ready to break out into that, but instead I'll ask Lee to follow.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear in the back? Is that good? Okay. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Bill said, very important things, explicate them a little bit. First of all, in terms of President-elect Trump, it is clear that he is an historic president-elect in the sense that he is the first president-elect we've had who does not have experience in government. We've had presidents, President Eisenhower, President Hoover, who were not elected officials previously, but they had substantial experience in government, so it's historic in that sense. And it was unpredicted. The insiders did not expect this. The pollsters did not expect this. Some of the major polls had polling errors as much as 6%. Interestingly, went the opposite way of error that occurred in 2008, when many of the pollsters were not picking up on the cell phone users, the social media folks. In this case, it went the opposite way. They were not picking up on a different population. It's clear, regardless of party affiliation, that this vote for president was a rejection of the party elites on both sides. Donald Trump campaigned against his own party's leadership and elites, and for the most part without their support. It also reinforces a shift in party politics, the outcome of the presidential election, a trend that has been occurring for a long time of the historic working class vote that Democrats captured over and over again at the presidential level. This really appears to solidify that shift to the Republican side, although President-elect Trump was a unique Republican nominee. And conversely, a shift that has been occurring for a while, but perhaps not as visibly as the working class shift, a shift of educated whites and higher educated population in general, more to the Democratic side. So those are important trends in the alignments around parties. As Bill mentioned, though, there was another election at the federal level. Of course, these are all state elections, but they deliver a federal outcome, and that is the Congress. And that was not so unexpected, what happened there. As Bill said, it was expected that it would be closer in both houses. It is. Perhaps not as close as people thought, but it is closer. It's also true that the leadership that would affect the priorities of people in this room around education and the workforce is essentially the expected leadership. So if you look at the majority leader in the Senate, it is not unexpected that the majority leader remained the same. If you look at the chair of the Education Committee in the Senate, it is not unexpected that the chair remained the same. It is not unexpected that the chair of the Finance Committee, where important education supports occur through tax policy, remains the same. On the House side, it was completely expected that the Speaker would remain a Republican. There were some doubts about whether he himself, the incumbent Paul Ryan, would want to stay there, but he has made clear that he wants to stay and will stay in the Speaker position. So that was not unexpected. While we have a change in the Education Committee, the likely chair was known before the election, and she will, in all likelihood, be the chair. The same thing with tax policy. The likely chair was known in advance. So these are all folks that Cale has worked with, many of the leaders in this room have worked with, and their role will be the same. And as Bill said, they too will want to make policy that speaks to the very populations that maybe surprised them in the presidential election, because there's a congressional election coming in 2 years, and President-elect Trump will be very focused on the fact that there's a presidential election coming in 4 years. It's very important to think about who did elect President-elect Trump. It is now, he did not win, and it appears he will not have won, a majority of the vote. This is the second time in 7 elections where the president will not be the one who won the majority of the votes. But he won very close to a majority of the votes, and he won them in the right states. So it's important to think about who those folks were who elected him through the popular vote process and the Electoral College process. And this speaks to party alignment, too. These are the folks who have struggled in the globalized knowledge economy. That's who elected President-elect Trump. And if you look at those party shifts, those that moved over or continue to move over to the Republican side, and those that moved over and continue to move over to the Democratic side, the ones who benefited from the globalized knowledge economy were shifting to the Democratic side. Very interesting situation, but if you're President Trump, if you're the majority leader in the Senate, if you're the Speaker in the House, if you're the Education Committee leaders, bipartisan Education Committee leaders, you have to think about those folks, because they are folks who have had an historic attachment to the workforce, oftentimes are disconnected from the workforce now. Their skills have atrophied, and our economy is at or near full employment, and in our 100 largest major metropolitan areas, virtually everywhere, with a few exceptions, we're at full employment. So we need them back in the economy. I think, Amy, I'll pause there, and do we want to dive right into specific policies?
Let's start to focus in now on more talking about higher ed, and in some ways as important, if not more important, workforce development, and what are the implications for this in terms of us as a group, and just the implications in terms of some of the legislation that's up and other regulatory matters that are up. What's it all going to mean now?
So there was an interesting change this year in our transition to a new president process. We have a newer law that went fully into effect with this election, and that process established transition teams for both of the major party nominees going on 9 weeks ago now. You might not have known that. There have been transition teams working on the transition to the next presidency for more than 2 months now. That's different than the way it was in the past in terms of a formal process established by the government. By the way, they're in the same building, so it makes for interesting elevator conversation during this transition process. So that gave a lot of us in Washington the opportunity to do what we traditionally do, which is talk to the campaign policy teams during the campaign, and we did that, of course, and I'll share some information from that period. But then it gave us an opportunity to talk earlier on to the transition folks, and in President-elect Trump's case, those are 2 separate groups. In Secretary Clinton's case, the campaign policy folks migrated into the transition team, different for President-elect Trump. So first of all, let's start with what the campaign domestic policy folks said about education in the workforce, and then let's talk about what the transition folks have said. And the transition folks have already delivered yesterday a first 100 days so-called landing team recommendations to President-elect Trump. So Dr. Sam Clovis, an educator, was the head of policy for the campaign team. He and others, John Mashburn and others on that team, talked about higher education in meetings with groups that we work with and individual meetings. In public on occasion, they talked about it. So when we think about the workforce first, before we get to higher education policy, that team and the president-elect himself talked about infrastructure, a very significant $1 trillion infrastructure program. We don't have the workers available for a $1 trillion infrastructure program. We introduced to that campaign team the idea that we would need a workforce development aspect of that program. That's not the way they've designed their program in terms of how it would be funded, but we put that on the table. We put that same thing on the table with the speaker's staff, and they were quite interested in that issue. And if you think about who elected President Trump, these are folks who could benefit from upskilling that would connect them to these high-wage, good benefit jobs that could have some career pathway associated with them. With respect to higher education, post-secondary education policy, the campaign teams talked about, and Dr. Clovis himself talked about, he would like to see, he caveated this with him being a realist, but he would like to see the financing system for students' post-secondary education devolve back to a local bank system. That's probably not realistic given, $150 billion going out from Department of Education, Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs in grants and loans for post-secondary education. But it's important to understand that perspective. He talked about something that both parties, both sides of the Hill have talked about, skin in the game for post-secondary institutions. What does that mean? You institutions assume part of the risk of lending to students relative to their ability to repay down the road. And he said a very interesting thing, and Bill made a point about new directions and innovation. It sounded like in this conversation he was talking about some kind of reserve that post-secondary institutions would have. And then he broke that out to say, but we would allow them, he was really saying this was his view, not necessarily the candidate's view, we would allow them to keep part of that money for an innovation fund that would be campus-based innovation fund. Kind of an interesting thought. So that was sort of the campaign policy team view in general. I would also say that both the campaign team and the transition team are talking about ways to bring private capital back into the lending market. As you all know, student lending market, as you all know, those tend to be supplemental loans. They tend to be a small portion of the total lending. The federal government dominates the prime lending for higher education. So they're thinking about that. The candidate himself took a fairly aggressive position on student debt loan. It looked a lot like Secretary Clinton's position before she became the nominee, not after she became the nominee. So essentially it would cap repayments of federal student loans at 12.5% of income. And assuming a good payment record, a good consistent payment record, it would dismiss the remaining debt, if there was any, after 15 years. That's a pretty aggressive position. It's more liberal than the current policy in some ways. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. There is, in the campaign and in the transition, there is focus on deregulation. And in higher education, they would like it to be very significant deregulation of higher education institutions themselves. The things that they are responsible to do in compliance with the federal government for campus-based aid, receipt of revenues through Pell Grants and student loans. But there is a cost for that in what the campaign, what the transition team has been talking about, and that is that the institutions would be responsible to constrain their tuition increases. Exactly how that would occur is yet to be seen. What role the federal government would play in constraining those tuition increases. There's also been a lot of talk about what institutions do with their endowments, what they would be required to do for their tax-free status. So all of those were in the mix during the campaign, are being talked about by the transition team. It's important to recognize that the leader on the transition team on education is a prominent person with regard to school choice. And he views that as important not only in K-12, but in post-secondary. And so they're looking at ways to promote school choice, particularly for very low-income students, elementary, secondary, post-secondary. At the elementary and secondary level, it entails a new block grant, significant new block grant, that would mostly come from existing programs being consolidated, that would entice states to invest large amounts for school choice in various types of school choice in return for receiving this money. So $20 billion from the feds, matched by $110 billion by states in order to to provide this money, with the hope, expectation that every very low-income student would have an opportunity, in the whole country, would have an opportunity for school choice with substantial financial support for that school choice. Translate that into post-secondary education, they would like to see, without a lot of specific policy around it yet, choices. One clear thing is that there ought to be lots of learning delivery channels, and that's not partisan, that's not President-elect Trump only. There's a lot of support for that, whether it is through competency-based education, whether it is through prior learning opportunity, validation opportunities, whether it is online, whether it is bricks and mortar, the various ways that learning can be delivered in the post-secondary context, and making sure that people have choices, not only about choosing, but about mixing and matching those things. So ways to promote that. In a very complex environment that implies, they're looking for ways to improve the advice that students and families get. And then finally, I think I'd re-mention, I've said it already, but specifically with respect to post-secondary education, looking for ways, opportunities to diminish the dominance of the federal government in student finance and bring the capital markets, the private markets, back into student lending. Now, that's a reasonable amount of detail, but honestly, if you went over, it's probably not up anymore, but if you went over to Secretary Clinton's campaign website and you looked at post-secondary education, it is dense. And the Trump policies are not. They're pretty light. So I'm going to now flip it back to Bill, because the Speaker of the House has spent a very long time pulling his whole structure, committee structure, Republican conference structure together around a plan for the next Congress called A Better Way, which is quite detailed, including issues around post-secondary education.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Let me, before I address that issue of Speaker Ryan's plan, let me just make it clear that when we come, we're not finished with the 114th Congress. The lame duck session will begin next week. It will begin next week on Monday, and on Tuesday there will be a straw poll, if you like, election of who will be the Speaker in the 115th Congress. At this particular point, it appears that Mr. Ryan has the majority of his caucus, but that's for the a straw poll, because the official vote takes place when we come back in when the 115th Congress convenes back in January the 2nd. The only reason I raise that is that there are still some outstanding issues that could be considered during the lame duck, one of them being your reauthorization of the Perkins Act, and I just put it on the record here that I've talked to the staff before coming out here, and nobody knows, given all that's going on, they will only be in session they'll be in session next week to do the organizational process, then they will go out for Thanksgiving, they will come back and only be in for about 9 or 10 days before the government funding, total government funding for this year is finished. So they have to do the basic, keep the knitting and do the basic work of keeping government funding. All this going on, so I don't expect a great deal to happen other than just keep government funding, and the question will be whether or not Mr. Trump weighs in with Mr. Ryan to say that you should have a full year continuing omnibus appropriation bill, get funding for fiscal year 2017 out of the way. Again, I'm getting to the point that Lee wants me to talk about, but the bottom line is, keep in mind, at the 30,000-foot level, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of other issues that Congress is going to have to address very quickly. Welcome to Washington, Mr. Trump. The statutory debt limit runs out on March the 15th. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but that is a real nuclear bomb. You have to pay our debts, and there's been discussion at one particular point about not doing that and defaulting. The federal government has never defaulted. The other issue, and this is critical to your discussion here, and funding. I don't think people realize that the level of funding when the president comes in, he's supposed to submit his new budget on the first Monday in February, that there is a law on the books right now that sets the total level of funding for what we call non-defense discretionary, which is the issues that would be workforce development programs. That level of funding between 2017 and 2018, when he comes in, is the same level. It doesn't go up. So we have an issue coming right off the top about the whole issue of spending, budgets, and deficits, which is where I've spent my career. Now, having said that, doesn't mean that you can't change those, and I think they will change those levels and try to work it out. But that's going to require some heavy lifting, because there are three things that I see that Mr. Trump in the big picture wants to address. He wants to address tax reform, he wants to address infrastructure, and he wants to address immigration. I think the opportunities lie there with an organization such as yourself in infrastructure and tax reform. The connection between funding for infrastructure is connected to corporate tax reform. And so I see this as an area where you want to spread out your reach, if you like, into these areas going forward. Specifically to what Lee was referring to, Mr. Ryan spent, when he came in, you remember he was a reluctant man wanting to take on the speakership. He said, if I'm going to take it on, we're going to have an agenda. And he literally worked throughout last year, and in June put out a whole series, about 6 or 7, what he called Better Way, his Better Way, a vision for a confident America. And one of these Better Way documents is poverty, opportunity, and upward mobility. Show my age. Speaker Ryan and I were fellow staffers together in the United States Senate. He was, as many of you may not remember, but he was just a staffer who worked for Senator Casten from Wisconsin. Senator Casten was on the Budget Committee. I was the staff director of the Budget Committee. So I have, pretentious on my part, I have some knowledge of Mr. Speaker Ryan. In fact, he has about half of my staff still working for him. And he is, I know there's my wife and I go back and forth on it. He is very committed to this issue of opportunity, poverty, and upward mobility. And he, in this particular proposal, he is focused, a section of this is focused very specifically on your area. And just to click off the kind of the high points, this task force has recommended, and it plays very nicely at what Lee has outlined. Number one, empower state and local community leaders and reduce overly prescriptive federal regulations. That is number one on their list.
I would also point out, besides the election of the House and Senate and the president, we had 12 governors that were up. And by the way, just for the record, Republicans picked up 3, I believe, Republican seats. There are 33 Republican governors out there today, and only, I think, 14, 15 Democrats. So Republicans are controlling, and state legislatures, too, are controlling at the federal and state. If ever there was an opportunity to move regulations, move responsibility back to the state, to the local level, it seems to me this election has pointed in that direction. Number 2, he wanted to increase transparency and accountability, streamline and reduce duplicative reporting requirements. I think on both of these levels, empowerment, increased transparency, there are things that a new Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Education could do with executive orders and not violate the Constitution. So I do think that those are things that can be acted upon rather quickly. And I'll add it just for, nobody knows for sure, but at least it's been reported that on the Department of Education, Trump has at least one of the individuals that he is seriously considering to be the next Secretary of Education, name that you will be familiar with is Dr. Ben Carson. And as it relates to labor, somebody I'm not familiar with, Victoria Lipnick, who's the Commission on Equal Employment Opportunity. Number 3, and this is critical, something that we've been doing a lot of work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and that is he wants, in terms of the better way, Congress to ensure that whatever federal dollars are spent on programs, they are aligned with today's workforce, state, and local needs. The zip word that Lee and I have a little project going on, the zip word around Washington these days is evidence-based. Everything has to be evidence-based. Personally, I always thought all policy was based upon evidence, but maybe not. But the idea here is that if there's going to be dollars coming out here to the state and local, you better be prepared to show that it has the impact that you say it should have. Otherwise, those dollars, with limited dollars, they aren't going to be forthcoming.
Bill, could I just quickly say something about that? Because that's the area where we've worked the most with the Speaker's team with respect to this set of recommendations. And that goes across several, not just the poverty section of the Speaker's recommendations or the Republican conference's recommendations. So it is evidence-based. As Bill said, a lot of us have thought for a long time everything should have been evidence-based, but it is also, if you think about it from the health perspective, payment systems reform, and that's already occurring. If you think about it from the education, human services, welfare side of the discretionary budget, it is, with respect to programs, it is about paying for outcomes. So you have to have the evidence that the model has promise in terms of delivering, but then you have to also have evidence that the outcomes were achieved, and payment partly dependent upon whether or not the outcomes were achieved.
Thank you, Lee. And the fourth and final piece in this was just a very broad limit federal role. It is a whole, it reflects the whole election. It's the consequences of this election is returning the power back out to the states and the local level. Federal government's role here will go down in terms of its activities, and that to me is the lesson to be learned. It's coming back out here to people such as yourself to actually manage and where we go.
Okay, I want to make sure we have enough time for comments and questions, so I'm going to ask you in 1 or 2 sentences, what advice would you give to the folks out here in terms of how to be the voice for adult learners, strategy, et cetera? Let's go.
So I would go back to who elected President-elect Trump and recognize that that's a political imperative for him and his team and the Congress, and that is to address the fact that they have not benefited from the globalized knowledge economy. Obviously, one thing our country can do, and we're lagging behind other countries, some of which would surprise you, significantly behind other countries, some of which, like India, would surprise you how far behind we are in terms of investment in improving the skills base of the workforce. So that's obviously a message that investment in education and workforce development is critical for the population that elected President-elect Trump.
Very quickly, go to your, again, the usual thing. We have new congressmen, new senators. Go to them and make it very clear, along with the new incoming president's cabinet and officials, to link what is clearly going to happen, ladies and gentlemen, infrastructure investment. It's coming. Link training, skill development to that train that's moving, because that's your opportunity to make it clear that it's one thing to have infrastructure spending, it's another thing to have the skill and the workforce necessary to carry out that spending.
Thank you. That's very helpful. All right, we have a few minutes here. I'm sure some people have questions or comments. If you could come up to the mic, we'd appreciate it. Please say who you are, too.
I'm
Thank
John
you.
Lopez. I'm from Central Michigan University. I worked for a long time in Southern Illinois, where
Can you put the mic up to your...
Yeah, we can't hear you.
I worked in Southern Illinois in a medical practice for a long time, where most of the economy there is agriculture and coal mining. And President-elect Trump promised, or has promised, that they're going to start digging coal again, and that he's going to bring all those jobs that went overseas back. And the economy in Southern Illinois, where I live, a lot of the industry has closed because they've outsourced the jobs. Now, one of the difficulties that a lot of those folks had is that they're locked into being there. It was mentioned that the large cities need workers, but the folks in Southern Illinois, and probably in every other place where those folks that elected the new president, want the jobs to come to them. When that doesn't happen, how is the Congress going to respond to the fact that these folks aren't going to move to St. Louis or Memphis or Los Angeles, where the jobs are, but are expecting the president who promised the jobs would come back? When that doesn't happen, how is Congress going to respond?
You've put your finger on a very difficult national economic problem. So it's important to remember that, Bill mentioned before how many folks, who voted for President-elect Trump were angry. And in some areas, it's surprising. Believe it or not, the unemployment rate in Michigan is 4.6%, but look how many angry votes about jobs were cast in Michigan. It's a different situation in West Virginia, for instance. It's important to remember that, mining and manufacturing, jobs didn't just go overseas. In fact, there's some evidence that more jobs were lost, significantly more jobs were lost in manufacturing related to technology. If you look at the steel industry, to which West Virginia is closely related, U.S. manufacturers are delivering more steel than they were a decade ago or 2 decades ago, with many, many, many fewer workers. So when you think about a West Virginia, you're not going to be able to quickly bring back mining jobs. If you increase, one of the things that President-elect Trump has said is to kind of open up the energy sector completely and bring in more of all forms of energy. Coal would be one of them, obviously environmental issues involved in that. But if you did that, it would probably mostly be done through improved technology. So I don't think anybody has a solution to what you just raised the question about. But the world is changing so fast, knowledge jobs are changing so fast, that it's not a bad bet in the state of West Virginia to invest in education and training, because it may not be as place-based a future in terms of jobs as it is now.
I don't have a good response to you, but there's one thing that when we use the term infrastructure, let's not just think of bridge, roads, and highways. Let's think about broadband. And broadband might be the answer to help address your concerns in downstate to Illinois. I do think an expansion of that creates opportunities for other growth in those areas other than the traditional mining and agriculture.
And broadband is a very important issue. Think about what workers today need. Broadband is relatively new. But in the time that it's been around, the U.S. has dropped from first to 18th in the world in terms of broadband speed and value for speed. In other words, what we pay for speed. So we've got to reverse. We've got to reverse that trend. We've dropped from first to 18th, just ahead of Slovakia.
That's comforting. Okay, next.
Hi, I'm Alan Mandel from the State University of New York, Empire State College. Thanks very much. Three things. One, a major point, but two, as a little preamble. I somewhat appreciate the kind of reasonableness of the discussion and the comments that the two of you have made this morning. But I think that if you're an immigrant, a black person, Hispanic, woman, or a lesbian, gay, you are downright frightened by what's happening in our world today. So it might be that there are policy moves that sound not as scary. But I think at the experiential level of those vulnerable populations, this is an extraordinarily scary time. And I think policymakers have to be aware of how scary that is. Second thing, just quickie. When you have people like Mr. Trump who are relatively, if not completely, ignorant of the policy level, it means that they rely on a lot of people under them. I don't think Trump is a particular ideologue, but I think he relies on ideologues. And I think it's really significant to not only think about what he is doing and what his thoughts are, but about those who are advising him. I think that's a really critical matter. The notion of Ben Carson as the Secretary of Education is a stunningly frightening notion.
Yeah, I understand.
Totally frightening. Yeah. Third point is a little different, and it really has to do with this issue of workforce. I would think that one of the very tricky things that all of us in this room are involved in is what is the relationship between training and educating? What is the relationship between workforce training, a training-focused, more instrumental notion, and what is learning? What is critical thinking? What does it mean to embed in, quote, workforce training, which is so important?
I'm sorry, we're having trouble hearing you up here, and I don't know why.
I'm so sorry. Can anybody hear? Is it okay?
But you're saying something important, so we want to
Yeah.
hear it.
I guess I don't know quite what to do.
Did you say relationship between training
I'm saying
and
the
trade?
focus on workforce training, unless we as educators
Okay.
think about the relationship between that and learning and critical thinking and a broader notion of educating and learning, we will fall right into an instrumentalist understanding of training, which I think diminishes the notion of education and is condescending to the people we are trying to serve. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Do you want to respond?
I would mention something that many years ago, Steve Case, who was a founder of AOL and sold it to Time Warner, and now is an important philanthropist around these issues, said when he was heading that company, and he repeats over and over again, is that, and this speaks very much to the knowledge economy to a great extent, but it has implications for very, very high levels of skill that people need in all jobs. You know, if you talk to, I think Cale has talked about this before, you know, the number of cognitive functions that's involved in using the cash register at McDonald's is very, very significant. But what Case always said is, I don't hire MBAs. I hire, nothing wrong with MBAs, but I don't hire MBAs. I hire liberal arts graduates because they've learned to learn. And the world changes so quickly that you have to learn your job every day. So what you said is fundamentally true, not just for the knowledge economy, but for all workers today, because skill levels are very high in all areas of work. I honestly think we haven't had the debate that you just joined. We have been very focused in this administration, in this Congress that we're in now, in the previous three, on the issue of what do we get for this 150 billion or so, 120 billion, 130 billion, depending on the year, of investment through grants and loans in post-secondary education. And the fundamental thing we get is people who have learned to learn if we're successful, but most of the debate has been about whether or not they got a job and whether the job was related to what they learned, what they were trained in, and whether or not it had a future for them. So I really think we haven't joined that debate yet, but it's a critical debate.
And we are running out of time, so I want to move quickly. I want to say, though, it's our job to make sure that policymakers understand that this idea of linking learning and work is not purely a very, skill-based vocational kind of approach, narrow approach. It's an integrated approach that allows for opportunities, that allows for career pathways, that can be really an idea of creating a pipeline, and that has to integrate the things that Lee was talking about. So that's an important part of the message, too, as we talk about infrastructure and connecting to jobs, and that the nature of work itself requires more than how do I work with a widget these days?
And I know we want to get to John, but I just, on the issue of optimism or not,
John, you can...
I just want to make a quick point. If you, and Bill and I have lived through this, we worked through this in the past. If you look at, it's pretty chaotic in Washington right now. Nobody quite knows where things are going to go. If you think back to perhaps a really chaotic time that was not too long ago, it was when Speaker Gingrich significantly drew in those very same voters we're talking about today that elected President-elect Trump and took over the House for the first time in 40 years for the Republicans. It was very chaotic in Washington. And the White House was on its heels. It really wasn't able to move Congress one way or another. Congressional leaders came together on a number of really, really important things. We got, for the first time, the low-income housing tax credit program. We got the Kassebaum-Kennedy bill, which allowed people for the first time to have portability in their health insurance. We got the first increase in minimum wage in decades. We got the CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Pretty impressive stuff.
Okay, because we're mindful of time, John, you are the last.
All right, I'm John Colborn. I'm with Jeffs Human Services in Philadelphia. Sorry that you can't hear. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to what is the coalition, the political coalition that is going to drive forward this sort of action going forward? Who are the allies that this crowd should be reaching out to in order to get the agenda that you all frame as opportunity propelled forward? Thanks.
My first quick response to this is that, quite frankly, I don't, what Lee has outlined is I don't think what we're finding is that Trump himself may have thought that he was going to be president of the United States. And as a consequence, he didn't specify and he didn't lay it out in detail. The good news from your perspective would be in that regard then that Congress and people who are concerned and who are interested in this, who have spent time at least beginning to really lay out to address these issues. I think you have to put some faith in the fact that this Trump administration is going to have to lean on the Paul Ryans of the world and the Pelosi's of the world to move forward on an agenda. That's where your focus should be, at least initially in those first 100 days.
John, we can talk about coalition, but let me just talk about personalities, and then they're looking at coalitions out there. The transition folks I talked about talking to before, to a person, and this is not the only thing we want to talk about, to a person, they talked about, policies that are career and technical education related. And that's bipartisan, bicameral. The Trump folks have talked about that. If you think about Dr. Fox, the incoming leader of the Education Committee in the House, she has a much more vocal, aggressive, conservative voice than John Klein, even though they're probably equally good, solid conservatives. Klein's approach, which I thought was terrific, was very focused on good public policy outcomes. Most recent conversation I had with Dr. Fox, and then she walked into a room and spoke to a large group like this and repeated it. And this was just before the election. It wasn't after the election. Elections have consequences. She said, I know that a lot of you know, well, first she said it privately, but in public she said, I know that a lot of you know that I'm a very, very conservative member of Congress, and I don't necessarily subscribe to the federal government's role in a lot of these things. But if I'm so fortunate to be elected to be chair of the committee, I am going to work to make better policy, and I want people to remember that in this Congress, we, the committee, produced a bipartisan, deeply bipartisan career and technical education bill, and we passed it through the House of Representatives. The Senate has not been able to do that. We passed 6, this is her speaking, we passed 6 broadly bipartisan higher education bills out of the committee and on the floor of the House of Representatives. And that's the way, going back to Bill's very early point, this is her talking, not me. That's the way, the only way we're going to be able to make policy going forward.
Okay, I want to thank our informed and, I think, inspiring panelists. Let's all show our appreciation.
This is a new beginning. I want to say Cale will be there to support us as we navigate these policy waters. You may recall that Pam Tate talked about how we are working now to develop a coalition with other organizations. Stay tuned. We will be in touch.